Great. Okay, I think we are good to go now. So, can we start, Lelys?
Yeah, Rafael.
Very good. So, Lelys, thanks so much for accepting the invitation again, now officially and on the record. So, Lelys, we're very happy to have Lelys here. She's a research economist at the World Bank, specialized in development economics and economics of education, right? And we're very happy to have you. You have 1 hour and a half. And if you don't mind, we like to bother our guests with questions in the middle. So I hope that's okay. And please, you have 1 hour and a half. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Rafael. Thank you also, Natalie, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here presenting this paper, which is titled Socioemotional Skills Development in Highly Balanced Contexts, Measurements and Impacts. This is a joint project with Pablo Egaña from Universidad Ibáñez and Claudia Martinez from PUC Chile. Right, so as Rafael was saying, I am a research economist at the World Bank, and I work particularly on studying how psychology-based interventions implemented in schools can have some impact on academic performance, but also on non-cognitive or social-emotional skills. I have projects in different countries in Latin America, but the project I am going to present today was implemented in Central America, particularly in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. Yeah, so please feel free to interrupt me with questions. I am happy to answer them while I'm still presenting. If you have questions and prefer to ask them at the end, that's also okay for me. Right, so this is the agenda I have prepared for this presentation. First, I'll start giving you a brief motivation for this particular project. I'll give you some statistics on the context, why the different questions that we are asking and responding in this paper. And then in the second section, I will give you details about the intervention we implemented in these 3 countries, and also the experimental design that we conducted with the aim to answer these 3 questions I'll describe. I'll spend a bit of time in the section 3 because we collected also very novel and interesting data for this project. Particularly, we're measuring social-emotional skills, which usually are measured using self-reported questionnaires. However, we wanted to and the issue is that they are affected by self-reporting bias. So we wanted to overcome that and use some apps to measure social-emotional skills, emotion regulation, and also a proxy for stress. Then I'll give you details about the empirical approach we're following. And at the end, I'll present the main results and I'll conclude. So that's a very standard agenda for an econ seminar. Let me now start with the motivation. Right, as I told you, this project was implemented in 3 countries in the Northern Triangle, or what we call the Northern Triangle in Central America. This region these 3 countries are among the world's 10 deadliest places for adolescents, particularly for adolescent boys. Just to give you an idea of how exposed to risky environments are these adolescents. In Honduras, for instance, they are almost 2 times more likely to die from homicide than from any other cause. And also in El Salvador and Guatemala, according to UNICEF, in 2017, 1/3 of all the deaths of adolescent boys was due to homicide in these 2 countries. So at the country level, adolescent boys, are highly exposed to violence, to any, particularly to high levels of violence, which is related to homicides. Even schools which are spaces that are supposed to serve as protective locations for these students, they are still very risky places for them. As you can see here in this news for each of the 3 countries, and these were in 2019, you can see that, for instance, in Guatemala, students are under the threat of gangs. In El Salvador, the second one, this one, dropout of 14,000 students are due to gangs. And then in Honduras, violence and school harassment is very prevalent in the country. So it's like schools are not necessarily safe places for these students. schools are not only affected by threats of gangs, but also they are affected by some other illicit activities such as drugs. As a consequence of this, that schools are not safe schools, are actually risky places for these students. Over 18% of them, on average in the 3 countries, dropped out of school due to delinquency in 2019. We argue that this is actually a lower bound because reporting that you are abandoning schools due to violence can also be a risk for the students, because then you are reporting that you are being either or a victim of, let's say, a threat from a gang. So it's higher than that 18%. What's the issue with these high levels of exposure in the country and also even in schools? There is plenty of evidence showing that exposure to high levels of stress or violence can have very important effects on an individual's well-being and also on the different economic opportunities that the individual can have in the short term, meaning educational system, but also in the long term. And that's more relevant when that exposure happens during adolescence. Why? Because that's when they are acquiring the human capital they are going to need to, for instance, have a better opportunities in, let's say, the labor market outcomes. The labor market. Overall, not only from the economic literature, but also from psychology, there is evidence that exposure to high levels of stress or even any sort of emotional instability can lead to a cycle of psychological poverty trap, also a greater likelihood to respond violently to stimuli, which is what we call in the econ crime literature this noble effect of exposure to violence. For instance, Damon Dussman find that when a child or adolescent was exposed to, let's say, domestic violence when during early childhood or adolescence, then this individual is more likely to be a perpetrator of higher levels of crime. For instance, if he or she was exposed to domestic violence, is more likely to be perpetrator of, let's say, homicides. And finally, there is also evidence that being exposed to these high levels of violence can have some unwanted results in terms of socio-emotional skills and also welfare of these exposed young individuals. Okay, in that sense, what can we do to address these high levels of exposure? We can implement several things. However, what we are arguing here in this paper and what we also found in the literature is that promoting socio-emotional skills can dampen these unwanted effects of being exposed to high levels of stress or violence. Why? Because socio-emotional skills can promote socioeconomic success over the whole life cycle of an individual, and also can promote the transmission of economic status across generations. The improvements that socio-emotional skills can have over different outcomes is actually very well established in the empirical research. For instance, we do know that higher or better levels of socio-emotional skills can determine better or academic success, also educational transitions. It can also improve cognitive development, particularly when the skills are promoted early in the life cycle. Relevant for this particular study is that socio-emotional skills can also reduce the probability that an individual participates into risky activities or can promote healthy decisions. And finally, something that's very important for the long term is that these socio-emotional skills can improve labor market outcomes. In that sense, the question is okay, let's promote socio-emotional skills, but then how? And in the literature, there are many interventions that can be used for this goal. However, what we found is that after-school programs can actually be very good examples of interventions for this particular context and for this particular goal, because they provide two important services. The first one is that they can protect children or keep them busy under formal supervision to prevent victimization and also delinquent behavior. particularly during a time in which they are more likely to be without any sort of formal supervision or adult supervision, which is either before they go to school or after they finish their classes. On the other hand, there is another service that these after-school programs can promote, which is the learning component, meaning that during that time that you keep the children busy at school, you can, if you add another, let's say, curriculum or some activities that can promote social-emotional skills and control of impulsive behaviors, then you can like take advantage of that time that they are in a particular space, let's say in school, and while you are protecting them, you are also adding this additional activity. It's important to note here that, for instance, from the education literature, they argue that just protecting children, meaning that just keeping them in, let's say, a classroom or in a school while they are playing soccer, basketball, etc., they are learning something from the interaction with other students. In this particular paper, what we mean with a learning component is adding something on top of that. For instance, a curriculum that teaches them how to control their impulsive behaviors, how to be perseverant, etc. Those sort of activities. And there are several evaluations that have been implemented of these after-school programs. In the US, for instance, almost all the literature you're going to find of these programs are from the US, but there are also other evaluations implemented in developing countries, such as some that we did in El Salvador with Pablo Egaña, and also another one, which is not a developing country, but was in Chile, was conducted by Claudia Martinez and Marcela Perticará, in which they evaluate the extended school time in Chile. However, although there are this evidence for these countries, the channel through which these programs impact operate is still unclear, meaning that we don't know yet. We know that the ASPs can work, however, we don't know yet whether it's because we are protecting the children or because they are learning something else from being in the after-school program. Yeah, please.
Can I ask a question? So,
yes, please, Rafael.
If you can go back one slide. So what is not clear to me, I understand that you cannot separate these things, but it was not clear to me why you're saying that learning really means promoting social-emotional skills. They could be learning other kind of skills, right? They could be learning how to play sports or something else that is important for them, which maybe reading or something, which are not necessarily emotional, correct?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's true. And it's about in the other slides. Actually, I'm more specific, saying socio-emotional learning. Yeah, but you are right here. I should write socio-emotional learning. What we are trying to analyze here is whether in these programs they are learning socio-emotional skills in particular. You are right. They may be learning, let's say, math in case you include this particular curriculum of math. However, the after school we are evaluating, it does not include anything related to academic performance. Although we do find some effects on academic outcomes, but it's because what we are saying is that the mechanism is through the learning of social-emotional skills. That's how they are improving their academic performance. They are, for instance, learning to be more perseverant. Therefore, they exert more effort in terms of academic performance, and that's why we see better results there. But yeah, so you're right here. We are talking only about social-emotional learning in particular. Yeah.
So these interventions are clearly channeled to or designed to promote, let's say, non-cognitive skills, let's say social-emotional skills, as opposed to math.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Lelys, well, I'm sure you will talk about this later, but just anticipating a little, the learning and following up on Rafael's, the learning portion of this is sort of endogenous, right? Especially, you know, like in the US, you send your kid to after school program just because of you want as a parent, or because the kid sort of wants, right?
Right.
So depending on the type of program that you attend to, may sort of reveal, you know, these skills that you already have on you.
Exactly.
Isn't it? So I'm assuming you guys will separate this effect, right? This is an experiment, but this is just my concern here, right? That it is a confounding factor, the fact that you may decide to go to a specific after-school program based already on the socio-emotional skills that you already have.
You're right, exactly, Natalie. So you have some sort of motivation, let's say, and therefore you're enrolled in participating in an after-school. And so we are going to find you're going to find some foundation, let's say, and on top of that, you are going to add additional impacts from attending an after school or not. So in this case, and that's true. However, what we are doing here is we are working only with the students that enrolled in the program, and then we randomize them, or we randomize the schools into the different treatment and control group. In that sense, you are right. We are not being able to say something between the students who enrolled in the after school versus those who did not enroll. We're only able to say something for those who enrolled and were assigned to the treatment versus those who enrolled but were not assigned to the treatment. So we are maybe, we don't know whether the effects are going to be greater for those who did enroll, because they maybe were more motivated, therefore the intervention was more effective for them. Because it can also be the case that those who did not enroll, maybe the impacts for them could be greater because they have like a lower initial level, let's say, of skills, right? But I cannot say anything about that. I can just compare, because it's an experiment and we work with the sample of enrolled students and schools. Well, it's a good point. It's something that we may need to learn, maybe from another experiment. Actually, just to complement that question, in this paper with Pablo Egaña, what we did was to also use the sample of non-enrolled children and try to see whether there were some spillovers there. What we're finding is that there are spillovers, and they are actually very, very important in terms of magnitudes. We found that there are effects on those who enrolled, but also those who did not enroll. I can say that in that experiment, but not in this one. We don't have the information for those who did not enroll, unfortunately. Thank you. Right. So why we want to disentangle these two channels? I can think on, or we argue at least these two reasons. The first one is because we have limited resources and we want to allocate them into what's more effective. And if at the end, just protecting the adolescents is effective, then all the resources should be allocated to just keep them under formal supervision. We don't need to invest into generating additional curriculum oriented to promote the socio-emotional skills that we were talking about with Rafael. And second, because if we at the end learned that this socio-emotional learning is important, then we want to invest in a curriculum that's more effective. And that means that, for instance, in this particular case, what we are doing is comparing two different curriculums in terms of intensity. And I'll give you more details about that. Right, so what we do in this paper, we answer 3 questions. The first one is, we ask what's the most relevant component in this after-school program. We experimentally measured whether the socio-emotional learning is or not more relevant than just protecting the children. And we analyze that impact in 4 categories of outcomes. The first one is behavior, the second school behavior, the second academic performance, the third socio-emotional skills, and the fourth the regulation of their emotions. Then since we find, and I'm going to tell that since now, we find that the socio-emotional learning component is more relevant than just protecting students. So then we ask what's the most effective curriculum. Here, what we did is to compare 2 psychology-based curricula that were very different. The first one is the virtual curriculum, which is a more intensive intervention, includes more materials, requires a larger training for the tutors, and it also requires right, and it was also developed, sorry, with a participatory process with the students in the region. The second one is a more standard intervention, mindfulness, and it's based on breathing, stretching, and other those sort of techniques that are easier to implement. They do not require intensive training for the implementers. So it's we say that it's less intensive than the other one, or less expensive as well than the other one. Right? And why we want to test that? Because if we, again, resource allocation, if the mindful intervention is less expensive and it also works, then it's perfect, because we can implement those sort of interventions at scale in an easier way. However, if the character strength intervention is more relevant, then a cost effectiveness analysis is makes sense to be done here and see whether the cost is like it is worth relative to the impact that it may have. And finally, we ask who is benefiting more from these two components. We study differences or heterogeneity analysis by the initial vulnerability of the participants, and we measure vulnerability using misbehavior at school, and also whether they were protected or not at home, using a proxy whether the mother was at home after school time. What we find here, just to summarize and just to give you the whole picture of the paper, and then I'll give you more details in the next sessions. First of all, regarding the first question, we find that the socio-emotional learning component is more relevant relative to just protecting students. And the magnitudes are actually pretty important. For instance, we find that the socio-emotional learning component improves behavior at school by 0.46 standard deviations, and it also reduces a measure that we have, which is a proxy for stress or alertness, by 0.45 standard deviations. Second, when we compare the two interventions I was describing before, we found that the virtual curriculum, the more intensive one, seems to be very, very effective in this particular context. With the caveat here that although the two interventions are similar, or the impacts are similar in terms of standard errors, the magnitude of the virtual curriculum is a bit larger. But we cannot reject the hypothesis that between the two interventions, the effects are different. However, virtual is more effective in different outcomes, such as behavior at school, perseverance, and alertness or stress. And finally, we find that the most vulnerable students benefit from being protected more than those who are less vulnerable. And that's pretty important, because in the first point, we found that for the average student, socio-emotional learning component is more important. However, for the most vulnerable student, we find that just being protected is actually good. To understand that result, we conducted some focus groups, and something very interesting we found is that implementing the psychology-based curriculum activities was very difficult for a student who had worse behavior baseline, for instance. They were less able to, for instance, do the stretching activities, the breathing activities, also putting attention to do these, the activities related to virtue, etc. Okay? Right, so that's like the whole paper, the whole project in a nutshell. Now I'm going to start giving some details. Yeah.
Lelys, I have a question for you.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, hi. Regarding your previous slide. So I was wondering to what extent this like training for virtual curriculum versus or on top of being protected, how complementary those two things are, and how complementary virtual would be with mindfulness. I know you didn't have an intervention where there are students with the two types of curriculum. So where you would see, for example, if one curriculum can, like virtual, can potentialize the effects of mindfulness.
I see.
So, because you're talking about cost effectiveness, so I was actually missing like whether one is superior because it complements more the other. two skills or the other two activities, I would say?
That's a good point, Renata. And right, so unfortunately, I don't have, as you said, I don't have like a 2x2 design in which I put the two interventions together, the virtual and mindfulness together. However, what I will say is that they are going to be positively correlated, because particularly for the average student, I will say that. Because as you'll see in the results, we are finding, although with mindfulness in particular, we are not finding a statistically significant effect. Some of the coefficients are positive. And same for virtue. For virtue, what we are able to do is, or the magnitudes are a bit larger, and although the procedure is the same, that's why we find more statistically significant effects for virtue. In that sense, both are positive. So I would say that they can be complementary. They can reinforce each other. However, that's just some I'm not completely sure, and I don't have a rigorous evidence to say that. But I will expect that. That's something that we could explore. We could explore in a different setting. Or you know what, I actually have the data, so I can try to see correlations between the different outcomes at the line and see whether, for instance, if I have some student that I can see has similar with their characteristics at baseline, but some of them are assigned to virtue and others to mindful, to see whether their outcomes at endline are positively or negatively correlated. That's something I could do. But again, that would be very, very suggestive only.
Or at a higher level, let's say at the class level, or I don't know, or something that aggregates, and you can see the average, the correlation between.
I can do that, Renata. It's a good point. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Right. So let me give you some details about the intervention and our design that help us to answer these questions. Right. So the intervention, it was implemented in 2019 by our partner NGO. They are Glasgow International. This is an NGO with operations in all Central America and Mexico. They offered clubs to 21 public schools, which were located in the most violent neighborhoods in the three countries. And the participants, the intervention is actually not highly intensive in terms of the length of the sessions per week, but it is in terms of the number of sessions throughout the whole academic year. They attend only 2 sessions per week. It's around 3 hours during the week, and during 7 months from April to October, which is more or less the academic year in Salvador. It starts in February until November. So the program targets students between 11 to 16 years of age, and that's in the case of Central America, it's very relevant because that's when they are more likely to be recruited by gangs, or they decide to enroll into these criminal organizations. Then these clubs, it's something very important in terms of scalability. These clubs are implemented by volunteers with no formal training on social work or psychology. Right, so in the design for this study, each of the sessions could include 2 parts. One was just extracurricular activities, and the other, on top of or in addition to the extracurricular activities, it could also include a psychology-inspired curriculum that promotes this social skills development. For those schools that were assigned to just extracurricular activities, we call that's the pure protection component. And for those schools who, on top of the extracurricular activities, we added the psychology-inspired curriculum, that's a treatment related to the socio-emotional learning, okay? Right, so in the extracurricular activities, the children are only protected, and they do some activities such as playing sports, doing craft, and these other similar activities. In those groups, there is a person who is supervising them, but with a very limited role, meaning that that person is not going to, for instance, teach them any activity related to the curriculum, to the psychology-inspired curriculum, okay? This person is going to be like in this photograph, this person is going to be there just to, for instance, give them the materials to the activity, supervise them, etc. That's his role. However, for school society, the virtue treatment, this session had two parts. First, they worked with this particular curriculum, and in the other part, they were doing the extracurricular activities. For the first part, the virtue curriculum, the goal was to strengthen participant character and also increase their development and psychological well-being. The program included a total of 32 sessions of training and also reflection over the 7 months. And this curriculum aims to promote some strengths related to perseverance, self-regulation, and others. Just to give you an idea, for instance, when they were working about building perseverance, there were 4 sessions. The first one was a training in which they discussed the different concepts. What's perseverance, how it can be beneficial for them in their particular context, either at school or at home, etc. Then in the other reflexive sessions, which were for this particular topic, there were 3. It includes an active learning methodology, meaning that they use some activities and materials to understand and try to apply the concept into their daily life. For instance, in the first session, they did the backpack activity, which this is one of the materials in which they discuss and write their 2 dreams, and then they discuss about what can they do to achieve that dream, and also what they're willing to do. Then in the second activity, the map, they took one of these dreams, which is going to be the long-term goal, and then they start talking about the different potential obstacles that they can face during that process to achieve that goal. And finally, in the third session, they talk about, or they implement the activity fighting for the puzzle, meaning that they have a goal, which is complete a puzzle, but to get each of the pieces, they need to exert some sort of effort. For instance, to do push-ups. So at the end, they learn that they are going to be able to complete the puzzle, but they are going to need to do something to exert this sort of effort. So the idea is you can have some dreams, you will need to do some activities, you are going to face some obstacles, but if you exert effort, you can achieve whatever goal you have. Okay, so that's the idea with perseverance. The second curriculum was also psychology based, was mindfulness, which is, I think that's more, you know that those sort of activities better, which is related to breathing, stretching, relaxation, and also focusing techniques. It was adapted by a program from the Lustre Learning Institute. It was piloted in 2017 by the NGO. And the idea is to use techniques to help the participant to develop self-awareness, mental concentration, and inner calm, and also to manage stress. Overall, the program that we used for this evaluation includes 16 different activities, which were implemented over the 7 months over the approximately 32 sessions. So the activities are, for instance, just to give you an example, the activity I'm calm, it included some techniques related to breathing, and like, for instance, the deep sun or butterfly breathing. The sun breathing, for instance, which is this image, they did this, they repeated all these steps 10 times within 20 to 30 seconds. And what's important here is that at the end, they discuss how they felt after doing the exercise. Why is that important? Because in mindfulness, it's relevant to understand how your body feels, or how you feel your body after you are doing any of these activities, because then you make that connection between your mind and also your body. The idea is that once they or after they are in the after school, they can do these activities at home, and so they can relate, or they can relate how they feel after doing the activities, so they know that they are doing the activities correctly, for instance. Right, so those are the interventions. You can see here, these are actually very simple activities, whereas here they require more discussion, more materials, a better preparation of the instructors, etc. The experimental design we conducted to answer the questions is summarized in this figure. Out of the 29 schools in the 3 countries, we randomly assigned 21 of them to either only the extracurricular activities, 7 schools were there, other 7 schools were assigned to both receiving extracurricular activities and virtue, and other 7 schools were assigned to, again, both extracurricular activities and mindfulness. By comparing these 7 schools with these 14 schools, for instance, we can measure just the socio-emotional learning component. Why? Because the 21 schools, students in the 21 schools are protected, right? But only these 14 are also receiving the additional curriculum on either virtue or mindfulness. So by comparing these 14 versus these 7, we are measuring the socio-emotional learning component. If we want to measure the pure protection component, we needed to have schools with no intervention at all, meaning the students were sent back to their home after school time. Due to the commitments of the NGO, we were not able to randomize schools to the pure control. So what we did is to create a non-experimental variation. We selected 8 schools using a propensity score matching, and these 8 schools are our pure control. So when we compare the 7 schools with this versus these 8 schools, we are measuring the pure protection component. Right, so we stratified also at the community violence level and a country level. That's the design of our experiment. Is there any questions so far?
Yes, Lelys. So
yeah,
you said that those people implementing these interventions have no formal training and are all volunteers, right?
Exactly.
I mean, these interventions don't sound so simple, in my opinion, especially the first one. So
exactly.
Are they? How do we know that these things are actually being implemented as we see here?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Right. So what we did was to train them. Right. So the training on the virtual intervention, it took approximately 2 weeks, in which the tutors or the implementers were trained on the concepts, on the different activities. They did mock activities between them, trying to implement beforehand the different exercises. Whereas for the mindfulness, it took only 7 days of training. Well, less than that, actually, just 1 week of training. And that's why we try to have these 2 interventions, which are very different. 2 weeks of training versus only 7 weeks of training. So in terms of like a process evaluation to see whether they implemented it correctly, we conducted some random audits in which a school coordinator visits the schools during some days and verified that the tutors were implementing the topic of the day. In terms of quality, we cannot say anything because ideally we will have to develop a tool to measure like whether they were implementing that with high quality or the quality that we expected. We are not able to say anything about that. We are able only to say whether they implemented the different the activity they were supposed to be doing at each of the points. Rafael.
So if I understand correctly, there was some training, okay?
Exactly.
And there was some let's call it enforcement or checking if they were actually implementing it as according to the program. The only thing that you didn't track is the quality of the implementation, right?
Exactly. Okay. Yeah.
I got it.
Yeah, which is it's actually very, very important, and In all my projects in which I am evaluating interventions, I have been able to do like a quality of implementation only twice, because it's actually it's costly, and it's also very, very difficult to do because you have to develop a very, very specific rubric. It is worth, absolutely, because then you can understand whether the results are, if you find, for instance, no results, you can understand whether that's a potential explanation. Yeah, is there any other question?
I suppose, schools were randomly allocated, and from 3 countries, is there like a good spread of the 3 countries across these 3 intervention groups?
Right, so we stratify at the country level, at the country and a violence level. Yeah, exactly, we stratify.
So you do have at least 2 schools
per country.
In each, yeah. Okay, I see.
Exactly.
I see. And about the intervention itself, how long does it take the mindfulness implementation? And I mean, like in the classroom, the students, how long they stay for mindfulness or for virtual or the extracurriculum? Do they take like 1 hour and a half or 2 hours per day? How is it? I think you mentioned, or I missed.
No, you are right. So I didn't mention that it's 1.5 hours total, and the idea was, but you're right. So half of the session was supposed to be devoted to the extracurricular activities, and the other half to the either virtual or mindfulness. However, mindfulness is faster to implement, and that's why we added the discussion at the end to have more like the time to be very similar between the 2 interventions. And in the schools assigned to extracurricular activities, the 1.5 hours were only extracurricular activities. They were only playing soccer, let's say, during the same time, because Renata, we wanted to control by the time that they were protected. We wanted to have similar time in both, in the three treatments.
I see.
Okay, good. Right. So in terms of the data, we collected these 4 categories of data. Our main outcomes are behavior at school and also academic performance. These are main outcomes because what we are thinking here is that the intervention is going to affect socio-emotional skills directly, and that's going to translate into either better behavior at school or improvement in their academic performance. Thinking on this production function of cognitive skills or behavior, for instance. So that's why we call the socio-emotional skills and emotional regulation and also our mechanisms. For behavior at school in particular, we collect administrative data, which are teachers' reports. We asked them, we needed some standardized measure of students' behavior, and so we asked them in the 3 countries to report whether the student behavior was excellent, good, or not good. And we also collected information on academic performance, particularly on math scores, because that was the curriculum that was more similar across the 3 countries. And these scores are on a scale between 0 to 10 points, being 10 the highest score. We also collected information on whether they were enrolled in school in 2020. For the mechanisms, we collected data on socio-emotional skills. Here we used an app, it's called Soft Games, and it includes three games that allowed us to measure these 3 outcomes. The first one is short-term persistence or perseverance. To collect that information, we used the additions game. It consists on, we presented a set of additions, which were difficult additions, and gave the student 1 minute to solve them. After the minute was over, then we asked them, we gave you this set of difficult additions. Do you want to continue with another set of difficult additions, or do you want to shift to a set of easier additions? If the student continues with the difficult additions, then that student is going to have a short-term persistence. If they decide to shift, to the easier, then that's going to be 0 in our measure. It's a very simple one. The second measure was self-control, and it was measured through the go, no go task. You may have played that game actually. It consists on, we show the student in a tablet, in the screen. The go stimulus was to tap the screen when they see a square of any color except black. If they see a black square, then they should not tap the screen. That's the no-go stimulus. So at the end, the self-control measure is estimated using all the correct times that the student, all the time that the student responded correctly to the no-go stimulus, when the student did not tap the screen because he or she was not supposed to do that, okay? When it was the black square. And finally, risk-taking behavior was measured using the BART game, and it consists of a balloon that each time you tap the screen, you like pump the balloon. The balloon can explode at any time after you are pumping like many times. So you can, after a certain number of pumps, you can save the balloon. You're going to win points only if the balloon doesn't explode, sorry. If it explodes, then you lose those points. So that's how you are measuring risk. You are tapping, but then you are saving the balloon after a certain number of taps, okay? So that's how we are measuring risk-taking behavior. This app was developed by a team in the bank. So if you want to use this type of games to measure these socio-emotional skills, happy to contact you with the team who developed this, okay, for your project. So using these 3 measures of skills, we create an index of socio-emotional skills. And finally, to measure emotion regulation and arousal, we used another application. We defined in this paper emotion regulation as a process that either amplify or attenuate or maintain an emotion, which involves developing this ability to affect your own emotional and physical response to the different stimuli. We also define arousal, which is what we call a proxy for stress or alertness that can affect your decision-making process. To measure this emotion regulation data, we use Reactiva, which is an artificial intelligence-based algorithm. What we did is the following. We show a student, using, again, the tablets, we show students different videos. These videos came from a data set that aim to create either positive or negative stimuli. Then using the front camera of this tablet, we measure the different, like the face and how they, for instance, raise an eyebrow, whether they move their mouth, etc. And using all those movements, we are able to predict different emotions. Then we translated those emotions into levels of alertness, which is arousal, or levels of regulation of their emotions. Okay, right. So we with this information, we're able to capture these 2 traits. It's actually pretty interesting because we also were able to correlate this measure with other measures of socio-emotional skills, and they are moving in the direction that we are expecting to. Right, so these measures were, by the way, developed by my co-author, Pablo Egaña. So also happy to introduce you to him in case you are also interested in using these tools. We were able to, just as a commercial, we were able to also collect this information on emotion regulation and arousal in another project in El Salvador using electroencephalograms. The advantage of using this application instead of electroencephalograms is that it's easier to bring to the field, although electroencephalograms are not that difficult. And also in terms of conducting that with students in schools, also using the app, the Reactiva app is more efficient because you can, there were some issues in collecting the data using the electroencephalograms. So I'll recommend to use this one relative to use electroencephalograms. And of course, they are way more easier to implement than MRIs or these other technologies that are impossible to bring to the field. Right, so very quickly, some summary statistics. These are the characteristics of these schools. From the 29 schools, they are, for instance, 72% of them are located in urban areas, 55% are located in highly violent communities, and they have actually very good infrastructure. Almost 83% of them have their own building, almost 80% have connection to water supply, etc. And almost 86% of them have food program. They are also relatively large schools, 341 students for the first 6 courses and 115 for the 7 to 9 courses. In terms of individual characteristics of all the students in our sample, which are around 2,000 students, half of them are girls. On average, they are 12 years of age, and they travel, in terms of exposure, they travel approximately 15 minutes from home to school, and 14% of them are working, 2/3 of them are living with both parents, and only 26% are living only with their mother. So as you can see here, a lot of them are living with at least one of their parents present at home. And in terms of maternal education, only 8% of the mothers have a university degree or higher. We have, unfortunately, imbalance in some of the outcomes at baseline, and for that reason, the empirical framework, for the schools, we have balance on all the variables. At the student level, we have differences in the outcomes at baseline. To address that, what we did in our empirical approach is to use a differences in differences approach. To measure, for instance, the net learning component, we restricted our sample to the 21 schools that were randomly assigned to any treatment, either psychology-based intervention or just extracurricular activities. And we estimate the equation number 1, in which we are interested in mu2, which is the effect of those who were treated in a school, either with mindfulness or virtue, relative to those who were only protected. So we are also using, due to our small sample size, we are using wild cluster bootstrap at the classroom level, and we are including here strata de-randomization block fixed effects. We are including some variables that were not balanced at the student level at baseline, and also the outcome at baseline. And all the other variables are pretty standard. Here, any T, because we have also, again, we wanted to see whether any of the 2 curriculum were generating an impact. We are here like putting together the 2 of them. In another specification, we separate by virtue and mindfulness. Okay, I'm going to show you the results as well. When we want to see only the protection component, what we found, we used the non-experimental variation, meaning we compare the 8 schools in the pure control group with the 7 schools in the extracurricular activities. And then we compare them and use also a differences in difference approach, with the difference that here in the question 2, instead of having any treatment or having virtue or mindfulness, I have here the extracurricular activities, the clubs, as an indicator. And yeah, all the variables are defined as in the first equation. Okay, so here θ2 is going to give us the estimated impact of being assigned to just extracurricular activities relative to going back to your home after school time. That's going to be θ2, the pure protection component. Here, mu2 is going to be the net learning component relative to the protection component. Okay, right. So these are the main results. First of all, when I look at the effects of using equation 1, when I want to see whether being assigned to any psychology-based intervention, either virtue or mindfulness, whether that has some effects on main outcomes, behavior at school, math grades, or school enrollment. What we are finding here is that it does, meaning that the socio-emotional learning component is relevant, but particularly to improve behavior at school. Okay, we find here that the effects are, as I told you before, around 0.46 standard deviations. We find no effects on school enrollment or math grades, which is something that we more or less were expecting, particularly because we were not implementing any academic intervention, as we were discussing with Rafael before, and also because changing and that shouldn't be that relevant, because what we want to change was misbehavior at school, and we are doing that. We are improving good behavior within schools. If we want to change math grades or even the decision of enrolling in school later, then we may need to add a particular academic component into the after-school program. Okay.
Lelys, can I ask a couple of questions?
Yeah, sure, please.
Firstly, I think you have mentioned, but I missed it. So when was the output measured? So the treatment was during 2019, right?
You're right, I did not mention that, Rafael.
Okay.
So it was measured at the end of the academic year. These are very short-term effects of intervention.
That's good, right? Because the pandemic came just after. So
yeah, we were very lucky, actually. Yeah.
There will be no paper otherwise.
Exactly.
Okay. And second question is, so what you're saying is the learning component have an effect on behavior, but not on test scores or enrollment or anything more cognitive related, right? But isn't that a bit counterintuitive in some sense, because we know that non-cognitive skills matter a lot for learning at school as well. So should we observe an overlap with grades?
Yeah, so that's a good point. Exactly. So they should be relevant, but it seems that in our case, there are the potential improvements in these other skills. As you will see, we actually are finding no effects on socio-emotional skills, but on emotion regulation. In that sense, it seems that the effect we're finding in behavior at school is driven by a better control of a student's emotions, but not necessarily by being more perseverant or being.
Can you remind me what behavior at school exactly? What it means exactly here?
So behavior at school, we ask the teachers to measure whether students had an excellent, good or not good behavior at school. For instance, if they have like a fight with other students, then that was going to be more likely that they were going to mark the behavior as being not good, for instance.
Yeah, but can you remind me how this is measured? So it's not those tests. How exactly is that measured?
Right. So we ask them. Sorry, we ask the teachers, remember during this period of time, what's the behavior of your students? Sorry, and in a scale from 1 to 3, sorry, evaluate that behavior. That was the measure.
So it was self-reported, not self-reported. So it was reported by the teacher, right? Is that what it is? And you ask 2 times, before and after. That's fine.
Sorry for that.
Don't worry about it.
I'm sorry for that.
We all teach here, we understand.
Okay, thank you. Right, exactly. So it was a report from the teachers. I'm sorry for that. Okay. I had a cough for the last week, so it seems that it's still there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly, Rafael. So it's actually it's a subjective measure, but not necessarily from the student, but from teachers. Yeah. Sorry. At some point, we did some estimations, in which we also included a teacher's fixed effect, because for some schools, the same teacher was working with two courses. So we also included that fixed effect, and the result did not change. Just trying to think whether maybe that subjectivity was also driving some of the effects, and that did not happen.
Lelys, was there any information on you know, sort of records that teachers sometimes keep, you know, like book records regarding bad behavior of the student. Like, I don't know exactly how to say it in English, but in Spanish, I remember we call it anotaciones, you know, of like bad behavior.
Right.
Was there something like that you could have used here also?
Right, that's a good point, Natalie. So there are like anotaciones for which are more or less like, for instance, I had a fight with my classmate, I like damaged school property. So those are 2 anotaciones. So that's available, but only in El Salvador. Neither Honduras nor Guatemala had that. So that's why we had to standardize how we were going to measure the misbehavior at school. I'll try to finish the seminar, but
It was
good.
yeah.
Sorry for that. Right, so that's and that's actually a good idea, Natalie. What I can do is to see whether those anotaciones are, I hope, they're going to be correlated with the measure of behavior that we requested to the teachers. Right, so then in terms of the protection component, we found no effect. We have found that just protecting a student have actually no effect on behavior at school or any other of the either school enrollment or math rates, which was very surprising. But then for us, was actually unexpected. So what we did was to conduct these focus groups, and what we learned from there is that it seems that schools are not necessarily the safest place for, and actually I show you that schools are actually very risky places for these students. So it seems that protecting them in these highly violent spaces are actually having these unintended or no effects of the intervention, which we were actually expecting to have. Then we see, okay, so there are some positive effects on behavior from the pure learning component, and we're finding no effects from the protection component. Let's see what can be driving those either positive effects or null effects from the 2 components. Is it driven by socioemotional skills, or by any of our measures of emotion regulation, which are arousal and valence? And what we found is that the socioemotional learning component, these effects, are not driven, as we were discussing with Rafael before, by the socioemotional skills. They are driven by a reduction on this state of alertness or stress, which is actually pretty important, particularly in this context. It seems that by being assigned to any of these 2 psychology-based interventions, students seem to be less stressed than those who were just protected in schools. In fact, when we look at the effect of being protected versus going back to your school or receiving no after school at all, what we find is that there is an increase on stress. Again, these schools are highly violent, they are very risky places for the students, and therefore the levels of stress or alertness are increased. So the intervention can have, just protecting the average student can have some, we say, unintended effects in terms of levels of alertness or stress, which is something that we were also very surprised when we found that effect. But then after the qualitative activities we conducted, we found that it makes total sense to find that.
And Lelys, is this due to virtue or mindfulness? Did you, when you separate the, I mean, this is actually just protection, no? Just
exactly.
Just extracurriculum. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
But
sorry.
No,
okay.
it's all right. But actually,
okay, so you just made, yeah, that's the one.
Exactly. That one is actually, and you can, well, I hope you can see here, but the blue line is indicating the,
okay.
Oh, sorry. Let me. Right, so let me here. Let me move this So you can see this, right? So this, for instance, the virtual intervention is here the blue line, and the mindful is the red one. What we are finding is that the effect, as I told you before, in terms of precision, they are actually very similar. The confidence interval are very, very similar between the two effects. However, the magnitude of the virtual intervention is a bit larger, and therefore we are finding a statistically significant effect, mostly from the virtual intervention. In that sense, for instance, we're finding greater effects on behavior at school. Also, in terms of socio-emotional skills, we found nothing in the index, but it seems that it can be driven, or we can find some effect on perseverance, and also the reduction in arousal is mostly driven by the group in the virtual intervention. However, between the two interventions, we can say nothing because they are not statistically significant difference between them. But it seems that the virtue is having a bit larger in absolute terms effects than the mindful intervention. We asked the students, no, sorry, I'm giving you more details about that in the other slide. Right, so at the end we ask, let's see whether the intervention is having some differential impacts by student vulnerability, which we measure in this particular case using whether they had a maternal protection, meaning whether they lived with their mother, or also if they have misbehavior at baseline. We found in terms of maternal protection that so in this table, I'm showing you all the main outcomes and also what we call the mechanism. And here in the first column, I am showing you the effects on those who were protected at home, meaning they have like their mother was present at home when they were back from school. Sorry. The second column, it presents the results or the effects on those who were not protected at home, meaning their mother was either working or they were not living with their mother. And here, the column 3, the difference between the column 2 and 1, the additional effect on those who were not protected relative to those who were protected. So here what we are finding is the following. The effects of the intervention between those who were protected versus not protected are higher in terms of behavior at school and also math rates. So it's like the differential impact is greater for those who were not protected at home, meaning that the after school or adjunctive protection channel is having these positive impacts for those who we are saying that they are more vulnerable relative to those who were already protected. Which is pretty important because although we found no effects for the average student, we are finding some effects for those who lack of maternal protection at home. These results are actually very similar to what Claudia Martinez and Marcela Perticara are finding for the extension of the school day in Chile. They are finding greater effects for those who were not protected, who did not have maternal protection at home. What's interesting here, and we are trying still to understand why, is why we're not finding important differences here in other skills. Sorry. It seems that the after school is helping them to have better behavior at school, like they're exposed to these other children, they are learning how to behave in school, whereas those who are at home are potentially learning other types of skills that are not necessarily taught in the schools. Sorry. Finally, when we look at the effects on the protection channel, but by misbehavior at school, we're finding again that those who were worse behaved at baseline relative to those who were well behaved at baseline, the effects are greater on behavior at school by almost 0.58 standard deviation. We don't want to oversell this particular result because at the end we're finding only one very important difference here. However, it's actually it was very interesting for us because since we found nothing in terms of for the average student, finding this difference for the most vulnerable one seemed to be very important and also worth to continue exploring in future projects or research. And finally, to conclude before I lose my voice, in this paper, what we are trying to do is to measure the differences in these two particular channels of an after-school program. We implemented that in these 3 very violent countries in the northern triangle of Central America, and we measured the effects on behavior, academic performance, and these socio-emotional outcomes and emotional regulation. Our results indicate that very clearly the learning component is very relevant and is more relevant than the protection component, and meaning that this psychology-based intervention or adding those activities on top of protecting students can have very important effects, particularly on behavior at school, which seems to be driven by a greater regulation of students' emotions. Sorry. In terms of what curriculum is better, we found that the magnitudes are more important for the curriculum, the virtual curriculum relative to the mindfulness curriculum, which based on our qualitative data collection, it's because it's a more difficult, it was not easy for the students, particularly for those who were the most vulnerable or with worst behavior at baseline, to participate in the activities related to mindfulness in particular, because it was more difficult for them to implement the breathing, stretching activities, etc. And although the results for no maternal protection are very interesting and are more conclusive than those in terms of worst behavior, heterogeneity by worst behavior, we're finding that it seems to have very important differences, the intervention in terms of the type of student that's participating in these activities. Just to finalize on policy implications or areas of future research that we think are very important, is that these results are showing us that it's are very important in terms of the design and also targeting of this intervention. We are still through these results, we open the question of what type of curriculum can be useful, but particularly for the more vulnerable students, because we do know that protecting them is good, but we want to also know what additional curriculum is going to be more relevant for them. It's still an open question to understand what's the role of the instructor. That's still a gap in the literature, and that's something that, for instance, Rafael was asking, how well prepared were them, because they were not specialists into implementing a psychology-based curriculum, for instance. So we had to train them, but what if we use people, or sorry, what if we invite specialists to implement this program? That's going to be more costly for sure, but that can guarantee that the intervention is going to be of a better quality, potentially. That's still an open question in the literature. And finally, something that's still, it is worth of doing, but still very complicated in this particular context, is to follow up students or the participants and see what are their longer term outcomes. For instance, in terms of labor market performance, or in terms of participation in criminal activities. That's unfortunately still something that we want to do in this particular context, but there is not, and there are some data limitations, meaning that there is not a unique ID that can help us to follow them into different data sets in the future. So that's still something that it's we want to explore, but we haven't been able yet. And yeah, so that's all I want to present you today. Thank you so much for your attention and for your patience with my voice. And yeah, happy to respond. I think we have a couple of minutes. Happy to respond any other question that you may have, or suggestion on how we can improve the current results analysis and also the framing of the paper. Thank you.
Thanks, Lelys. That's very interesting work. Congratulations.
Thank
you. I will just ask one question. So actually, maybe not really a question, but it's more of a food for thought. So it seems that the discipline learning, let's say, was an important component, right? So of your effects. And if this is the case, and it seems to me that the pandemic has put a special or a stronger burden on people that have poor discipline, I would say, because they had to study at home and try to follow school from home. I don't know exactly how the pandemic was handled in the education system in these 3 countries, but you know, I believe it was the same everywhere. So schools tried to move online. It was very, very difficult, right? And even for those students who had internet access and computers or phones at home with internet connection, they were finding it very hard to follow the teacher and to you know, complete their assignments. Plus, this requires a lot of discipline, right? These are families that usually do not have, the parents do not have the time to follow and make sure that they are following everything. So discipline seems to have become more important in the pandemic for student outcomes. So I was wondering, perhaps this is a good way for your study to pursue like a new question, right? So it's not only about long-term consequences. We lived a crazy couple of years after your experiment. So this might give you opportunity to say, look, this is a unique opportunity to look at the importance of, I don't know if it makes sense for you, but.
That's a good point, Rafael. And actually we have not exploited that venue, for instance, to try to sell the paper. That's still something that we have not say anything about. And that's actually a good point, especially because we could follow some of these students, those who are still in the educational system, and see whether after the pandemic they are still at school, how they are behaving, etc. That's something we want to do and we are planning to do. And yeah, so that could be one mechanism. It's because they have more discipline, and therefore they were able to be engaged during the pandemic into the virtual learning, or through the virtual learning. So that's something we have not, and I think we should actually exploit that as a potential explanation. Thank you. The discipline, which is more related to self-control, but not necessarily self-control. So yeah.
That's right.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Any other questions?
I have one. It's more like a comment. Thank you, Lelys. And I'm sorry to have missed a portion of your presentation, so maybe you said something about this, but I was just curious and related to a presentation that we saw here as well a couple of weeks ago. Are there any room for peer effects here? I wonder, like, if a student that gets to a specific program, ASP program, may, you know, sort of influence friends or classmates that are not necessarily in the program or were in a different one. Like, is the data that you guys have like allow you to measure something like that?
Right. We were able to measure that in the other project in El Salvador with Pablo as well. And but in this one in particular, we were not able because the IRB did not allow us to collect information for those who did not enroll. In the other project, we were able to do that, but here, since we had the 3 countries, we were not allowed to do that. For instance, let's say that we both enrolled, but Rafael did not. In the other project, I was able to get information from Rafael, not his name, but at least his behavior at school and also his scores. But in this project, we were not allowed to do that because we wanted to do that to measure spillovers. For instance, to see whether the saturation in terms of treatment at the school level could affect also the outcomes of Rafael. But we were not able to do that, unfortunately. Because you're right, actually, what we found in the other project that the peer effects or the spillovers, we call them, were actually very important. And in terms of magnitude, they were not similar, but if I recall correctly, it was almost half of the effect, the direct effect. So in our case, in case we have spillovers, and I think we have, these effects I was showing you were actually lower bounds of the total potential effect of these type of interventions.
Thank you. And all the analysis was a pool analysis, or did you guys explore like country-specific results, or if you did, like, did you observe a difference?
So we did not exploit the country level information because we will have power issues. However, I think that we did something, and we did have power issues. That's why we are doing all the analysis at the aggregator level. But let me re-estimate those results and see whether, because the specifications have changed since we did the country level analysis. So let me.
Yeah, I was just curious to see if, you know, the reactions were, or the results were sort of similar across. Or...
Yeah, we always say that these three countries are very similar. However, based on my experience, I will say that we are going to find better effects in El Salvador relative to the other countries. Because it's because of the implementation, and you have more experience working in El Salvador than the other two countries.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Any other questions? I think. Okay, so maybe not. So I guess we can let you go. Lelys, thank you so much again. It's been very interesting and very relevant for Brazil. I guess we Latin Americans have a lot in common, especially in bad topics like
exactly.
that. But it's very interesting work. So thank you
very
so much.
unfortunately, but true.
That's right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you again, Natalie, Rafael, and
Nice.
nice to meet you, Renata, and everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Ciao, ciao, ciao.